Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Rachel Stoll, Senior Vice President for Research Programs at the Stimson Center, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, The World Rewired, a Geopolitical Outlook for 2026 and Beyond. I know we had been hoping to see many of you in person for this event, but given the stubbornly icy weather in and around Washington, D.C., we're welcoming you here today to an all-virtual event. Thanks to all of you for tuning in from wherever you may be. It's sure to be a fast-paced and dynamic conversation as we take stock of a world being reshaped in real time. Less than a month into the year, 2026 has already opened amid profound upheaval as foreign policy disruption transforms global dynamics across regions and issue areas. From fracturing alliances to emerging flashpoints, the months ahead will test the resilience of international institutions, the adaptability of national strategies, and our collective readiness to confront an uncertain future. The Stimson Center has long prioritized anticipation over reaction, emphasizing the need to understand not just what is happening now, but what might happen next. Our Strategic Foresight Hub serves as a critical planning unit for the organization, drawing on the wealth of Stimson expertise, from intelligence analysts and technologists to regional experts and senior advisors, to credibly identify and plan for global risk, power shifts, economic pressures, and the strategic choices that lie ahead. Today's discussion brings together expert analysts and thinkers, both inside and outside of Stimson, who will help decode this new era as we explore a range of issues from Latin America and European security to great power competition and technological rivalry. If you've decided to spend the morning with us, you've chosen very well indeed. In the sessions to follow, today's experts will identify and explore the trends that may define our era, the shifting alignments in global power, the risks that have crystallized in regional contexts, and the choices facing the United States and its partners as America charts a new course for competition and instability. This is not a conversation about a distant future. It's a frank assessment about the decisions being made and the forces already in motion that will shape global affairs, not just in 2026, but for years to come. If you're craving some additional reading, I encourage you to take a look at our top 10 global risks for 2026 by Bob Manning and Matt Burrows, Stimson Center scholars with deep experience serving on the National Intelligence Council, or NIC, the premier analytic unit in the U.S. intelligence community. This annual assessment, now in its 9th year, provides our experts predictions for the greatest threats facing the world and serves as the jumping-off point for the discussions to follow today. Before we go further, a few housekeeping notes. This event is being recorded and will be available in full at stimson.org/events. We'll be welcoming questions at specific points in the program, so if you have a question for our panelists, you can submit your queries through the Q&A function below on your Zoom panel. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, who is sure to set the pace for a morning of frank and unsparing assessments on a world rewired. Kurt Mills is the Executive Director of the American Conservative and a respected voice on geopolitics and U.S. foreign policy. A widely cited analyst of U.S. foreign policy and global affairs, Kurt is a frequent commentator across major media outlets, offering sharp insight on the strategic forces reshaping the international order. Kurt, we're so pleased to have you with us today as you set the scene for us. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Rachel. So the center was very gracious to ask that I speak a little bit about the history, or at least to jump off by starting with the history of our magazine, The American Conservative. It's an unusual product, to say the least. The magazine, in my view, marked the foundation of what I will call conservative anti-globalism. I think much remarked upon at the time and better remembered are the WTO protests of the late 90s that sort of ushered in the era of left anti-globalism, and obviously those protests were very left-coded. A right-wing outfit doing much of this stuff, especially back then, was far more novel. Given especially the warm feeling after the Cold War towards U.S. military buildups on the right, towards global capitalism and the like. The Iraq War occurred in the aftermath of President George W. Bush having a 90% approval rating just after 9/11. We were founded by Patrick J. Buchanan, the Tucker Carlson of his time, who had run in the previous election in 2000 for president, but he did not do quite as well as, say, Ralph Nader, who had performed, if not decided, the 2000 election. The general atmosphere, the thrust was the right was winning, right? Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Clinton had governed as arguably the most conservative Democrat imaginable and still managed to get impeached, and the Republicans won the White House still. Let's ignore the popular vote thing. So yeah, the magazine was founded in the late summer of 2002 at seemingly the worst time. First issue, October of 2002, and this is around the vote of authorization for the Iraq War. A vote Hillary Clinton was for. A vote Joe Biden was for. A vote John Kerry was for. And a vote that other leading senators, such as John Edwards, rest in peace, were for. And a vote a magazine called Freshly Minted, The American Conservative, was steadfastly against. The title issue was called, in October of that year, was called The Iraq Folly, and it warned that not only would the invasion be morally and strategically wrong, but that it wouldn't work. Quite a claim, actually, as the U.S. had recently expelled the Taliban from ruling authority in much of Afghanistan and had al-Qaeda on the run. Never mind, as we would learn later, that the Bush administration had brazenly let UBL escape at Tora Bora in December of 2001. The magazine's leadership, we were co-founded by Buchanan, Scott McConnell, the former New York Post editorial board member and leader, and an ex-neocon, and the columnist Taki, was actually split on the 2004 election. Pat voted for Bush, claiming party loyalty, a little curious because he had challenged both the father and the son for the presidency and had run third party just years earlier. McConnell took the plunge and voted for Kerry, and Taki voted third party, the Constitution Party. 2004's voting is interesting in retrospect because someone's vote remains rather unaccounted for. Indeed, his once rival and still aspirant successor, Ted Cruz, repeatedly asserted in 2016 that Trump had voted for John Kerry, dissatisfied with the administration's foreign policy. Donald Trump, as he moved more firmly into the Republican Party, he had basically been a Clinton Democrat for some years and flirted with a run for president under the Reform Party banner, of course, sought to cover up this episode. Another current Republican cabinet official, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., actually published an article in Rolling Stone called "Was the 2004 Election Stolen? Surely not a sign of things to come." Bush won, of course, and our magazine actually almost went under, which is a story for another day. But it carried on to see its original work grimly vindicated with the spectacular collapse of the Bush presidency, with two failed wars, and when the globalized economy came crashing down in a style not seen since the days of the old right itself. Our magazine is often associated with a style of conservatism that presages or precedes the pre-war and the pre-Buckley eras. Bush in his second inaugural mentioned an ownership society, quote unquote, based on mass home ownership cooked up by the feds, and a freedom agenda that told the world when you stand for your liberty, we stand with you, begging the obvious question by the end of his term, kicked off by Hurricane Katrina and ending in mass evictions everywhere from LA County to Loudoun County. If the Bush White House stood with anyone besides the American people. With Bush receding from the scene, the dissident right movement, our ranks seemingly split between so-called Obamacons who gave the new president's anti-war messaging a chance. These figures were anchored around McConnell at the magazine, but a new movement anchored around an old figure, Congressman Ron Paul, and later his son Rand, a newly minted senator, provoked the magazine's curiosity, the so-called libertarian moment. This era is perhaps most associated internally with the editorship of Daniel McCarthy, especially as Dr. Paul the father ran a spirited challenge to Romney in 2012, provoking the support of then less relatively prominent financiers such as Peter Thiel, and former House Speaker Newt Gingrich had a presidential campaign essentially bankrolled by then less prominent Sheldon and Miriam Adelson family. Obama, of course, was a disappointment. I think most everyone besides those who work for him glumly concede that now, albeit for different reasons. But the magazine did participate in a notable episode, more or less defending the 44th president's Iran policy, with McConnell supporting the original Iran deal outright, and Pat telling no less than Sean Hannity at the time, live on air, Sean, your friend Bibi Netanyahu, has been talking about Iran getting a bomb since 1992. In 2006, he said they'd be building 25 bombs by the end of the decade. Are they? No. True then, true now. TAC didn't quite know what to do with Trump, and I guess is still figuring it out. There were those in our ranks who basically sympathized with the policy, but fretted that perhaps the never-Trumpers were right about the man's character. Someone who had that perspective was then a little-known writer called J.D. Vance, who had recently essentially launched his Hillbilly Elegy memoir in our magazine, who did not vote famously for Trump in 2016 on character grounds, but also took to the pages of USA Today at the time to extol his foreign policy. 10 years ago next month, headline Trump speaks for those who Bush betrayed. They've lost their jobs, their families, and their faith. The usual Republican bromides won't cut it. We'll say other writers didn't have such scruples, including myself at the time, who thrilled from July 2015 on, sad to say, to the now president's iconoclasm towards conservative pieties, and in some sense, believe the Trump era has been a perversion of the original thrilling primary message ever since. Last word on magazine lore, but you guys asked for it. I'm aware of just two people Donald Trump has ever apologized to: the First Lady after the Access Hollywood scandal, and Pat Buchanan in the summer of 2016. Apparently to bury the hatchet from some ghastly things Trump had said in the tussle for the Reform Party nomination in 2000, but also in a nod to Trump's awareness of the ideological debt he owed to Buchanan, like it or not. There's some whispers of Buchanan perhaps getting the Presidential Medal of Freedom. We urge the White House to move on that fast. Since taking the helm of TAC here in January of 2024, I've had a back to basics approach that I think will keep our journalism relevant, because I think it's where the party and the country are now irreversibly moving, no matter what this president does. The key planks of this conservative anti-globalism, in my view, and these are the anchoring precepts of Trump and Trumpism, if there is such a thing. It is foreign policy, realism and restraint, immigration restriction, and trade nationalism. I think you see this play out in real time. Even when the president does maneuvers on foreign policy, such as the abduction of Nicolas Maduro, land grabs or potential land grabs in Greenland, support for the protesters in Iran, it always has to be anchored in the language of sort of realism and restraint, even if it's a sort of a MAGA and drag act. But Trump is not just merely returning the seat. He is not just regurgitating Bush-era lines so much as the party establishment would, of course, prefer that. He has to sell it to his base, anchored by luminaries such as Tucker Carlson, Steve Bannon, Marjorie Taylor Greene, or risk the wrath of his right flank. On immigration, you see the importance of this issue in real time, tragically, in Minnesota. The administration is unlikely to simply just back down. The administration is unlikely to cut a so-called comprehensive immigration reform bill. Trump knows and has repeatedly cited that he is the president of the United States because of immigration concerns. And indeed, to the extent that we have much in common with Europe, you see this anxiety bubble up across the right-wing parties in Europe, and I think that is something that is not going away. Whether or not the U.S. can ever come to some sort of immigration accommodation, you've seen, this year basically Trump reverse the disastrous Biden open borders policy that existed from 2021, or de facto open borders policy that existed from 2021 to 2023. But the problem in some respects is that it's been just too easy, actually, that Trump did not get to talk about immigration as much in 2025 because shutting down the border was relatively so seamless. Enter the ICE raids in places like Minneapolis, but of course, Southern California and other locations. These are far more divisive, deadly, ugly, grisly. Other people within the president's orbit were potential rivals and successors, such as Rand Paul, the senator from Kentucky, have floated other maneuvers, such as basically an amnesty that would not give illegal immigrants citizenship, but would otherwise normalize them. This potentially is a solution, but it's probably going to be very unpopular with segments of the right because it would obviously bake in the demographic changes in the country that are making so many anxious. These are subjects that are just not going away. The former White House chief strategist Bannon has been urging in recent days Trump to hold the line on this. This is all in concert with an idea that the country has had too much change too fast and in a way that is not actually affecting the bottom line of the median voter, of the average American. And indeed, for generations now, sadly, supermajorities of Americans, with occasional exceptions, have said the country is going in the wrong direction. And finally, the issue that is perhaps of most importance to Trump himself, which is the trade nationalism component. I also don't think this is going away. The other successors, such as potentially Ted Cruz or Rand Paul, might try to do away with it, but I think they will struggle with it because the verdict actually has been pretty unclear. The Liberation Day tariffs, even though they scaled them back in the summer, did not crash the economy. And early signs are that some of these maneuvers are more successful than people were inclined to give it credit. And I think that these three yeah, key policy innovations, foreign policy restraint and immigration restriction and trade nationalism or trade patriotism, are here to stay on the right. And no matter what happens, these factors will continue to shape the right, the country, and shake the world. Thank you.
Kurt, our thanks to you for your history lesson and for your insights and perspectives here as we examine a world grappling to untangle American primacy and America first. Thank you for your remarks, thought-provoking as always. Now I'm glad to welcome our panel. As they say, welcome to the age of chaos, with our discussion to follow. It's my pleasure to introduce our expert panel and moderator to this virtual stage. Matt Burrows serves as counselor in the executive office at the Stimson Center and is the program lead of the Center's Strategic Foresight Hub. Kelly Grieco is a senior fellow with Stimson's Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program. Yun Sun is a senior fellow and director of Stimson's China program. And our esteemed moderator for this panel is Steve Clements, editor at large at the National Interest. Steve is the founding editor of Semaphore, as well as holding several senior editorial roles at The Hill, The Atlantic, National Journal, and Quartz. Steve, thanks for driving the next conversation. With that, the floor and the panel is yours. Take it away.
Rachel, thank you. And I still see Kurt on here. I want to thank Kurt Mills for giving us a really great distillation of the moment and the changed political tectonics of this time. One of the things I found most fascinating about Kurt is he rooted it in a lot of fault lines that existed in the past. I think a lot of people are making a mistake at looking at this moment as being driven by a single person, a single leader, a single president. But a lot of these issues that we're seeing, and the dramatic changes in the topography of global affairs, national security, the way alliances work, have antecedents. And it's really a pleasure to be here with Matt Burrows and Kelly and Yun. But I've been following Matt Burrows' annual take, his Foresight project, for many, many years. And if I'm going to be honest, Matt has been predicting where we're at for a long time, seeing, in fact, what you would call chaos to some, but a reordering for quite a long time. If you take a look at the 10 top global risks for 2026, the report that he and Robert Manning have authored for this year, they go through a lot of things. They look that, and most of them either have orange or red warning signs in terms of the 10 issues: the Trump economy and where it's going, the dissolution of order as we knew it, the U.S. pivot to a Western hemispheric focus, which means a pivot away from an other foci, a third nuclear era, which we'll get into. Looking at generational changes, not just in the United States, but the world, the Gen Z rebellion, looking what an empowered Putin means in the world, which I'd like to drill down into, climate decline and what the natural disaster part of this equation will mean, and a ongoing, persistently dangerous Middle East. Of course, technology coming on top of this. Technology has always been something that has either enable powers or destabilize or change things, but AI may be, in fact, a very different kind of future change maker, if you will. And then also looking at the Asia Pacific, in which there are so many dynamics. And Ewan and Kelly, I really look forward to getting that into you. But let me just start with Matt. So Matt, I guess my, excuse my voice. Matt, my assumption is you have been seeing for a long time the wheels coming off a global order, institutions that didn't reflect the rise of India, didn't reflect the rise of Brazil, a lot of governance challenges. You even wrote in years past about a kind of strategic contraction of American ambition. So my question to you is, is what we're seeing under the Trump administration right now essentially speeding up a history you already saw coming?
Obviously, by announcing, in the national security strategy that we're no longer aiming for a primacy, which, no other president, even though I think Obama understood that, it was beyond our reach. But no other president has ever said that. Now, I do think that it's going to be kind of a zigzag motion, because if you read that security strategy, it's quite revealing that you say, no to primacy, and then in the next paragraph, we want dominance in the Western Hemisphere, and we also want to hit back at China. So I think there's going to be lots of contradictions in that. But I do think that he is accelerating it in part because he's completely destroying some of the better parts of American influence in the world, and what makes other people like America, from the humanitarian assistance, to science, all of these things that really, I think for most people in the world, is what made America great. And instead focusing simply on the military, which I think is going to be off-putting, certainly to the ones who are victims of it, but to other people too, that it doesn't seem to chime with their idea of what America was supposed to be. I mean, help others, just not itself.
So just one more step on that, and I don't mean this in a demeaning way, but I was just in Davos, and you could feel the end of the global order, just the punctuation point. Even if you look forward to NATO, and Europeans have said, wow, he blinked on Greenland. Everyone basically knows that the dynamics of fundamental deep trust in what the U.S. will do to be with them on their dark days, that's over. And on top of that, there's a new, what Kurt called trade nationalism, mercantilism, that has come out. So I guess my question to you is what we're seeing from a lot of people that have seen America, from their perspective, was king of the hill and now is kicking down its own hill. I guess my question is, if there's a paradigm shift that I would argue is not just because of Trump, but it's because of other factors. A lot of domestic factors that felt dissatisfied with what they were getting from the American social contract. My question to you is, if I didn't care what people think about what America is, but I care about power, and I'm going to just provoke you, isn't some of what we're seeing, if that world is going to come apart anyway, isn't it somewhat of a smart move to untether yourself from an old framework that doesn't deliver anymore to something new?
I think, Trump, and I wrote a book on this. I mean, Trump is very good at destroying things. And I think we are in this moment that we want to get rid of what we see as, too generous an attitude towards others. But, if you're doing strategy, and it's supposedly what the national security strategy was about, you want to actually be thinking about how you build something that is going to maintain and pursue not necessarily primacy, but U.S. well-being, influence in the rest of the world. And I think, you know, not having that idea, not institutionalizing something, because we have to realize, and this was always my feeling, is, we're 360 million or what people, but all these other, you got two giants, China and India hasn't really come to the fore yet. I mean, we're going to be, and some of them both of them are developing very fast. We're not going to have the leverage that we used to have. So I think you do want to put in some things that make sure that the U.S. and the West generally still retains leverage and can shape the world. I don't think, extracting a leader from Venezuela or making threats to everybody, it does that.
Kelly, let me jump to you. You recently wrote this paper, very interesting. National Defense Strategy has the right principles if it fails to follow them. This is, to come back to what Matt says, there's a line in it, the days of the United States propping up the entire world order like Atlas are over. So, and I remember when Jeff Goldberg did this really long survey and interview with Barack Obama. The bottom line of, I think, 8,000 words from Obama was America was facing a problem of global sprawl that it hardly had consciousness about anymore, and that the danger to America was the hijacking of that capacity for purposes other than U.S. national interests. So again, I'll ask you in another form what I asked Matt, given that statement from Obama and given what you've outlined as possibly a refocusing and narrowing of American objectives in the national security space in the world, what's wrong with that? Why should we lament that? You say we're not living up to a contradiction, but I'd love to get your sense of where we're on from a theoretical and doctrine direction on the right course.
Yeah. So, I think the way I think of this is sort of two parts. There is the diagnosis of the problem, which you laid out very nicely, which is that the United States is clearly overextended. It's been overly ambitious over the last 30 years. And that is particularly problematic as we're now seeing other rising powers that increasingly challenge the order, like China. That there needs to be some kind of better accounting system that we match means and ends. And I'll just say, I think the national security strategy, for example, does a good job for the first 11 pages or so about being really blunt and direct about this, that US primacy is not sustainable. The problem, though, in the NSS and the recently released national defense strategy is they don't really follow their own advice. I think they believe they're rejecting primacy, and they're certainly rejecting a liberal primacy, liberal with a small L, meaning the values of democracy and free trading system. But they're actually, if you look at what they're actually proposing, and I'm not sure they recognize this, they're proposing their own version of primacy. It's just has a different value system behind it. I've called it civilizational primacy. So they're talking about still the United States remaining the most powerful country in the world, but they believe they have another way to sustain it. And some of that is by actually having allies and partners do more, shifting more burdens, and some kind of almost sounds like a tributary system in some ways, that these allies, if they do more, they gain more access to the economy. And so it's a different version of sustaining it. And then it is adding of this really ideological piece around this notion of civilizations and civilizational struggle. So it is very ideological and even talks about interventionism in Europe. And so it's very contradictory, but I'll just note that right diagnosis, but they still don't break away in reality from primacy. It's just a different version.
So one of the other elements of the national security strategy was the expression of concern about civilizational erasure in Europe. Don't really think that went over well among Europeans, but to come back to your notion about civilization disruption, one of the things that has confused me, to come back to Matt and the contradictions he's laid out, and I'll bring in Yoon here, is if you believe for a moment that AI, which is outlined in this report, is a staggeringly important competition for the so-called West or for the United States to win. It seems to me, from what I have learned about the AI race, that, from large language models, from what you do, that you need Europe in that race. You need perhaps India in that race. You need other blocks of the world if you're going to deal with a highly competitive China in that race. And if you believe, as some have argued, that that's an existential race, then why wouldn't some of these other foreign policy areas fall behind? Why would you alienate India, as we seem to have with tariffs? Why would you alienate the Europeans, which have been such close allies to the United States, with language of civilizational erasure? So I guess my question is, what's real? I mean, I'd like you to go into the contradictions and help me understand them.
Yeah, so I would just say that the contradictions I don't think are an accident. I think they're a feature of this administration. Many people have said, like, the national security strategy doesn't really represent the Trump administration because Donald Trump really dictates policy, and that's true. But I actually think that this document does a really good job at actually showing the different contradictions within the administration, the different positions. On the point you're making about this, like, artificial intelligence, or the things where it would seem like we need allies and partners to actually support our positions to try to, certainly balance against China, whether it's in artificial intelligence or other areas. I would just say that I think this goes back to their view of the world and the distribution of power. And some notion of, if you notice, Matt brought this up, they talk about the United States as a laundry list of things that we're going to remain the most dominant nation in. And so in a way, they don't see allies and partners as being important in many respects, and supporting issues like artificial intelligence and norm setting, because they think the United States is so dominant and they'll just simply fall in line. And so in a way, they understand there's this resource problem, that we're not sufficiently powerful anymore to do everything we've been doing in the world. Yet at the same time, they're still really overestimating in some fundamental way the US ability to do things unilaterally. And they haven't really come to terms with that contradiction in any way. And I'll just note, just one final point is just, I don't know if I would necessarily term artificial intelligence as a race. I know that's often said, and that it's a race. It's a little like trying to win a race for electricity, because it's so fundamental to how the future of the economies are going to be done, and to military power itself. Where there is, I think, a really active competition is going to be around norm setting. What the norms are. And that is the place where you do need more than just the United States to set those rules. You need allies and partners to also support that position, which is why it's so self-destructive in many respects to turn Europe, for example, into almost an adversary, when you can ask them to do more, and they should do more, but they don't necessarily need to become your enemy in the process.
Well, I want to get into that, because sometimes things you think you should do but aren't being done. I think that gets to the title of this session, chaos. Right. So if there are a lot of things we should be doing and need to be doing from your perspective, and we're not moving in that direction, so I think it's interesting. Yoon, I want to tell everyone two things. One, you can post your questions in the Q&A, which was mentioned before. We have almost 300 people online, so that's great. I would ask everybody, I see Corey and others, the shorter your questions are, the more likely we're going to get to them. It's great for other people to see them, but we won't be able to do the very long form, so go short form with questions. Then Yoon, who's with us, is going to be leaving at 10:40, not out of disappointment in the panel, but she's got another deal, so it's great to have you. But Yoon, you've written this great piece, and it's badly titled, A Perfect Storm for Taiwan in 2026 in Foreign Affairs. I think it's a perfect storm for the world, because when you look at what you're getting at, and the purges that we're seeing right now around Xi Jinping, the ascension of Xi Jinping, certainly Taiwan and the fate of Taiwan is part of this. And I want to ask you just point blank, is Venezuela, is the focus on Greenland a green light for China to move on Taiwan in this period of time? Why wouldn't they? But secondly, given everything you just outlined in terms of significant changes within China about what's driving it, isn't this a much bigger story than Taiwan?
Thank you, Steve. This is a terrific panel, and I'm so glad that we're unpacking the global chaos. I think China definitely fits very well in this picture. Look at the chaos, if you will, in coming out of China just this past week, and also look at the Chinese response to what the U.S. has done since the beginning of this year.
Why don't you give people a quick snapshot of what's happened inside China?
Oh, so yes. So last Saturday, about 4 days ago, 5 days ago, the Chinese announced that they are removing the most senior uniformed military leader of the People's Liberation Army. So this essentially is what we are looking at is the most senior Chinese civilian leader has removed the most senior Chinese military leader out of power. And I think coming from a political science background, I think that raises a lot of questions about civil-military relations. I think people's imagination goes a little wild that is there a coup in China? Will the PLA push back? Is she going to be removed? What does this mean? So I think that's very reflective of the chaos as a theme. So in terms of what the Chinese have seen our policy going since the beginning of this year, whether it was 2025, which I talked about in the piece, but when they look at Venezuela and Greenland, I think the Chinese most direct response is, wow, there's really no global norms or international order anymore, right? And this is a theme that we have talked a lot about in the US policy community. What is the norm and order that we're still following if we're going that far to claim the territory of a NATO ally, and we're going that far to dispatch our military to capture the leader of another nation and bring him back to the United States for trial based on domestic legal interpretation. So I think that definitely gives the Chinese a lot of creative thinking, a lot of imagination. And the most direct conclusion is that if US can do this to other sovereign nations, why can't we do this to Taiwan, which is not even a sovereign nation by our definition and by the definition of most of the countries in the world? So this domestic jurisdiction piece, and also the piece that, well, we can just do what we want because might is right. And we can come up with explanations for this and then have multiple interpretations with double standards, with multiple standards as for what other countries should follow. So I think that raises a lot of imagination and creative thinking in the Chinese context. What does this mean for the world? I think it definitely adds the element of uncertainty and chaos for the international order as we are debating it. Thank you.
So let me ask you a question. I think that I may get this wrong. Matt would know. Was it the Federation of American Scientists that have this sort of doomsday clock, that you were getting closer and closer
The
minutes?
Federation of Atomic Science.
Atomic science. I love that clock, but you're always on the edge of real, it's like watching an episode of 24 all the time. But Yun, I guess reading your piece, where is that clock on the likelihood of China taking kinetic action or much more direct action to control or take over Taiwan? My sense is you're very much predicting something that many people, what I find interesting, I'm going to get into this, is, and I don't know whether to call it being imprisoned by inertia of how everybody's thought about foreign policy, and then things change and say, oh, we already saw it changing. I guess the question is, most analysts I know and respect don't think that China will take on the cost or risk of what it would entail if it moved on Taiwan. I'm wondering whether that's mistaken, and you're actually saying that inertia in thinking is mistaken, that the dynamics are very different, and the likelihood of China action on Taiwan is much more palpable and much closer than we realize.
I think that's essentially what I'm saying, but with a slightly different manifestation. So I agree with you. I think in the policy community, people have had this long-standing conviction that China is not going to use force because they cannot be sure about the result, and because they do not want to put up with the cost, whether it's sanction or diplomatic isolation. I think all those are true, but now I think the question is, what if? We know that China has had a pattern of pushing the envelope when they believe they can get away with it. And we saw this most vividly when Xi Jinping visited Washington in 2015. I think the narrative has been, or the versions are being told is, well, Xi Jinping looked at President Obama in his eyes and promised that China would not militarize South China Sea. And then he went back to China and did it anyway. Why? Because he thought he could get away with it. So now I'm seeing that there is a convergence of factors that could give China a different interpretation of the assumption that they have had associated with most importantly, U.S. military intervention in a Taiwan contingency. Because in the Chinese mind, if there's no U.S. military intervention, Taiwan is not a problem. The PLA can definitely prevail. Their military budget is 8 times that of Taiwan's, and their troops is more than 10 times larger than the Taiwanese military, right? So the whole piece has been hinging upon how U.S. would respond to a Taiwan contingency. And now I think the Chinese are getting much more confident about their ability to, one, to hold off the Americans and also to impose costs on U.S. behavior. So I think they're less convinced that U.S. would absolutely intervene in the Taiwan contingency.
So let me go back to Matt and all of you. I'm really bad at cultural references and metaphors, but when I was in Davos, I mean, the takeaway is Donald Trump and the U.S. delegation dominated Davos. Mark Carney and Canada won Davos. That when you kind of look at, this, some people began talking about something I don't know very well, The Hobbit, depicting the United States as Mordor, and the Middle Kingdom represented by Mark Carney is going to come along and, organize the bullied to begin reshaping and filling and changing this. Matt, it was really fascinating political dynamics in Davos, which was a kind of, gunfight at, OK Corral, this session of kind of looking at who's going to drive power. I guess my question, and we've got Ron Peters who's posted a question here and others that have asked the question about your thoughts on Mark Carney's speech and what are both the stakes and the possibilities that the Middle Kingdom, the middle powers, can redefine power and work around and preserve some of what they think are important global public goods in this moment versus what they see as the U.S. wrecking a lot of it.
Can I hold off for just a second on that one and just,
Yeah.
I'm not, the China scholar, but I wonder if there's a different scenario on Taiwan. And that is that Trump and Xi make a deal. That basically the U.S. drops this, at least what Biden said was he was going to defend Taiwan, more or less indicates, so long as it's peaceful and you have a negotiation, then, I will basically say, U.S. favors that unification so long as it's peaceful, in return for which we make a deal on critical minerals. And, we already see the Taiwan Semiconductor Company building fabs in the US. So it's not as if it will be, we'll have a huge chip shortage if you have an invasion.
So you're saying that Trump could negotiate away Taiwan?
I can see that as well. I mean, it gets, it means that China doesn't get, sanctioned and everything else, and basically gets that, and Trump gets, guaranteed critical minerals. And, I don't see that. I think for China, it's a bigger prize to get Taiwan than to hold on to the critical mineral supplies.
So both sides get something big, but the global axis changes.
I mean, I think Trump still does think in deal-making terms. Now, I'm not, this
well, we'll let Kelly and
Ewan
come into this. We'll let Kelly and Ewan come into this, but I want to ask you about the Mark Carney dynamic right now, which is another part of an interesting earthquake out there that, Mark has become the unlikely hero of a lot of the world that it feels bullied.
Well, I've been talking about middle powers and how they're gaining in status. And I do think I think we're seeing a world being recreated, basically, of people trying to go around the US. And that goes for the Europeans. You may see them as a sort of middle power, where they're now, and they started this during the Trump's first administration, making all sorts of deals, trade deals, to try to diversify away from their dependence on the US. And I think that's going to be the case with a lot of countries now. But there is kind of a limit to middle power because, again, if you think of scenarios, if US China get into a war, maybe, the middle powers will try to stay out of it, but nevertheless, it's going to have a huge impact on everybody, on everybody's economy. And and they, lots of middle powers rely on China. So I do think there's a new dynamic in that, they don't want to be in anybody's pocket. I mean, they're not going to line up with the US. We're not going to have another Cold War. The way people always have been talking the last few years, is going to be another Cold War with US and China. I don't think you're going to find, lots of allies wanting to join in that. They want to stay, this is kind of the second edition of India's non-alignment. I mean, we've gone to an advanced portion. So yes, there is increased power, but there are some limits as well.
So let me ask Kelly and Yun to comment on what we've discussed, but I want to piggyback on that and talk about this. We've got Madhumita Dutta, who's actually posed something I'm interested in, which is this assumption that many of the strategic class have out there. That, yes, we see the focus on the Western Hemisphere. We see what that entails from the Donroe Doctrine, which the White House is calling it. But a lot of people in Asia, my friends in Japan, in Korea, in ASEAN, are largely seeing status quo relationships. And Mr. Dutta asked about what's the future of the Quad. Is it unrealistic in another blind spot to think about our larger U.S. engagement and footprint in Asia is going to somehow remain as it is, driven by what we used to have, essentially the current continuity, or is that going to be part of the discontinuity picture? Kelly?
Yeah, so, I think one of the things, just to go back to Carney's speech, why I think it resonated is it captured how a lot of states are responding in this moment, especially medium powers, of seeking out alternative partnerships. And I would just note that that is probably accelerating under Donald Trump, but you can go back to the last administration and see the same thing with countries trying to create other alternative strategic partnerships, whether that's as a plan B or to increase their own power to improve their negotiating position in US-China rivalry. So this is a structural trend, I think, that's driving this approach towards multi-alignment. I don't think it's entirely about Donald Trump, even if it's accelerating it. And I'll just say that, so when we look at something like this.
So is it whining and whelping that won't matter?
I think it depends. It's going to depend on the country, I think, a little bit too. If you're looking at something like Japan or Australia, or even South Korea, I don't expect them to leave the United States alliance, like certainly not willingly, right? They want to maintain the alliance system with the United States. They would prefer for it to be a bedrock of their security. Korea is maybe a bit more questionable, given its, flirting with nuclear proliferation. What they want, though, is to also have a backup, right? The United States is not seen as entirely reliable, so they're trying to create an alternative. But there's also practical realities they recognize, which is there isn't an alternative for U.S. military power to a large extent. So They're kind of in a position where they need to kind of, maintain the relationship with the United States, even as they try to expand other options, particularly in other areas where the United States is not as active, like in the free trade space, finding alternative partners or a norm setting around things that they care about, around, artificial intelligence, things like that, trying to work together. But I think the reality at the end of the day is that the United States, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, still has a need for allies and partners. And you see that reflected even in the language of the strategic documents. It talks quite differently about the Indo-Pacific compared to how it talks about allies in Europe. And so there is some recognition that it's going to have to work with allies and partners. What I think is more disturbing in my mind is it doesn't actually have a clear vision of what it wants allies and partners to do in the Indo-Pacific.
And I would like to get your take on that, but I want to add one more piggyback thing. I remember hanging out with old, many years ago, Soviet, scholars, also Russian scholars looking at Russia and what it become. And, the bias was largely, and I'm going to be honest, Russia was a basket case country, mainly a gas station for the world, not taken as seriously. And I think part of the humiliation of that has driven Russia's behavior. We can debate that if you want. But what Putin has done, and one of the moments outlined in this excellent paper by Stimson and Matt Burrows and Bob Manning, is the empowerment of Putin, not just over Ukraine, but that muscularity, risk-taking, cutting cables of neighboring countries, threatening, meddling in their internal politics, that muscularity has given a premium to the perception of Russian power in the world. And I'm wondering, is Donald Trump not doing the same thing? That you've taken a largely benign, or not to everyone, but to many, a benign, predictable, feel-good America, soft power, and it's now become muscular and nasty. And that's given a premium to the perception of American power in the world that it might not otherwise have had. And my question to you is China watching that? Is China about to become more muscular and nasty?
There's an interesting debate ongoing about that, and I think the most acute question asked by American watchers and grand strategists is China exploiting the opportunity and coming in and eating our lunch, right? Now, United States is becoming this muscular, some people would use the word bully, that is China trying to play benevolent? Is China trying to position itself or present itself as a benevolent alternative that is more stabilizing and is also willing to share the benefits of its growth and its opportunities? And I think the answer to that question is not really. If you look at China's policy towards Europe, I think the Chinese perception is that while Europe currently is in a weaker negotiation position because their security alliance with the United States is being shaken. So the most direct conclusion is that Europe should not stick to the same bargain and demand more from China. In fact, Europe should become more pragmatic and be more humble, if you will, in their relationship with China. So you see that China trying to claim that it is the stabilizing, benevolent alternative to the United States, but I do not see that as a very persuasive story, and I don't see people buying it. On the question that you asked earlier about what does it mean, this Donald Doctrine, for countries in Asia, I think Kelly is absolutely correct that there are many countries still cannot live without a security tie with the United States, right? You look at Japan, look at South Korea, they might flirt with the idea, especially South Korea, they might flirt with the idea that, maybe we can build a better relationship with China, we can balance between these two. But as in U.S. feels such an important role in their national security strategy that they will not be able to eliminate that element in their security. But in the end, there's a cost-benefit analysis. For Japan, is it more expensive for them to carry the current burden of what, for example, Trump administration is putting on them in order to maintain the merit and the viability of this security alliance, or it is more costly for them to go on their own? And I think the answer is very clear, and I suspect that's going to be the same answer for Europe, that it is still important for them to maintain the security ties with the United States at a higher cost, but either for viability reasons or for economic reasons, to completely replace that with their own effort is going to be more costly. Thanks.
Matt, thank you very much. Matt, one of the couple questions that have come in on Iran from Syed Kamar Afzal Rivzi and others, I think one of the questions, and I think Kurt presented what he sees as a holistic view of this moment, rationalized by Pat Buchananism, etc., a kind of pugnacious nationalism. And clearly the MAGA base, to some degree, has the view that America has been ripped off and taken advantage of in many of its global engagements, and thus withdrawing from those, focusing on the U.S. is there, which is why Venezuela was so surprising to so many in the MAGA base. Or you had Marjorie Taylor Greene coming out and saying a lot of this global adventurism is antithetical to the politics that got Donald Trump into office. But this question here about Iran, which we haven't really gotten into, because Iran is unfolding maybe one way or another. I'm just interested in what we're learning from what's driving U.S. foreign policy now. Does an attack on Iran fit that model? Is it another contradiction, as you raised out? How do you see Iran, Matt, and the consequences of deeper U.S. action inside Iran?
I think for Trump, yes, the inclination is to hit hard, but I wonder, he's also tied with the Saudis and the other Gulf, and whether they are increasingly worried that actually you could see chaos not just in Iran, but also outside, spilling over into the whole region. So I think, and Trump's family interests are with the Saudis. He has to make sure that he doesn't alienate them too much. At the same time, I mean, I think he wants to make sure that Iran doesn't have the means to develop nuclear weapons, particularly on his watch. Because
I guess the question I'm
undermines
asking
his
is,
credibility.
the question is, how does Donald Trump explain his doctrine, the Trump doctrine, which most people thought was semi-isolationist, don't get engaged, don't chase monsters around the world, that it was a hyper-realism. How does that fit that story?
I'm not sure there is a Trump doctrine, to be sure, as Kelly was saying. I mean, it's what he's thinking at the moment. I mean, there are huge contradictions. But I think where it does fit is that I bomb, I don't send troops in, I don't get engaged in it. So that we just want to really destroy their ability, particularly on nuclear. What happens after that to them, we don't really care. But as I say, that will run into some, pushback from the region, which they're on the front lines. But that's how he would explain it. Is I'm not getting engaged in it, but I am keeping the bad guys down.
Kelly, the punctuation point between the realization under Eisenhower that the United States was the definitive global power in the world at that time, other than the Soviets, was the Suez Crisis. And that's where the UK was perceived, you're no longer in control. The US is now driving everything. One of the questions I have out there is what's the Suez Crisis that says the U.S. is no longer in definitive control? Or has Donald Trump sidestepped that by being a big, more closely defined power that's willing to deploy power but pull back? Does that evade the Suez Crisis of the perception of the world that we're just no longer that matter? Or are we rushing in to many Suez crises? Take your pick, where the world just decides, screw you, we're now going to organize to contain the giant. I'm just interested in how you see that.
Yeah, so, I think Matt's exactly right. And that if there is like a Trump doctrine, it seems to be this notion. It doesn't actually reject interventionism, even though it says that. It rejects their version of what they consider interventionism is, which is regime change, where you're bringing in lots of forces to try to turn regimes into democracies by point of the spear. They've clearly rejected that, but they are quite comfortable using force in many places as long as it's air power. So that it's an air power centric form of intervention that they see as being able to achieve decisive effects quickly and rapidly. And I would just say that that's a misreading of actually what has happened so far, which is potentially dangerous. And so, to one sense, you're right that they're not wrestling with the limits of U.S. power, which a Suez moment kind of brought for Britain, by trying to rely on what they see as a quote cheap form of U.S. force, which is air power. And I just say that that's also not entirely true, that air power is cheap. I think the danger here is that the more they do this, the more other countries will adapt to the U.S. using force in this way and be able to counter it. But also, there's an opportunity here to miscalculate, that they get themselves into real trouble. Like the Operation Venezuela could have easily gone wrong, and we would then be at that moment. But if you're thinking about a real Suez moment, I think it's to go to Yoon, and it's Taiwan to me would be the moment that you'd most clearly perhaps see a recognition of limits of U.S. power if the United States decided to, not get directly involved.
Yun, if I were to make a movie on the Suez Crisis, would it be a hit in China?
It potentially will, because then the Chinese conclusion would be, well, look, U.S. is stuck somewhere else, is completely bogged down in the Western Hemisphere. Donald Doctrine is real. And what does that mean for our sphere of influence? We should be able to do what we want to do in our neighborhood, since Taiwan is literally just within 100 miles away from China, right?
Right. And let me just pick at Yu Chang on this, ask a brilliant question, is how is China's evolving strategic communications to the global south, to its terrain, looking like right now? I remember when Frank Fukuyama wrote a piece during the Gulf War that China was just on a global charm initiative. Hey, look, look what America's doing. I'm just interested in whether China is somehow taking advantage of this. I want to tell everybody, normally my voice sounds like Bing Crosby. It's really, if any of you remember who that is, maybe Michael Bublé, but having some challenges. But I'm interested in how their communications are. And on top of that, and you got into it in your piece a little bit, what are their internal fragilities, securities, the vulnerabilities?
For the global south story, I will have to say that developing countries and global south countries have been much more tied into the Chinese economic orbit, if you will, because first and foremost, the Chinese have financing and have the capability to build infrastructures. And China has also massively promoted their export, the export of, for example, their green technology. You look at how much green technology bases China is building in Africa, you'll be surprised that, well, what is China's goal here, and where is Africa sitting in the whole scheme? So I would say that the global south has a much more some would say vulnerability, and some would say that a complex economic interdependence with China, because some of the things that China provides with global south is not replaceable. There is no other country that is able or willing to provide to global south countries what China is providing currently. So I think the China's narrative on global south has been consistently, well, without naming names, but targeting the U.S. unilateralism and targeting U.S. hegemonism as a problem for the international order. And now under the second Trump administration, we think that China definitely putting their efforts and prioritized efforts in spinning the narrative that China is a stabilizing power. China is reliable. China is not going to change its policy overnight. And China is predictable. So I think that has create a lot of currency for a global south that is living in uncertainty, if you will, about what Trump's policy would look like. So I think some of the countries definitely welcome this this more stabilizing effort that China, or this image that China is trying to strike.
Kelly, thank you. Kelly and Matt, let me ask you, go back to the national security strategy, which Nadine has asked, has it affected at all our discussion? It's where we started, so yes. But I would come back to, I'm oversimplifying and overstating this, but the national security strategy basically says Europe is a problem, Asia is a challenge, but really soften the tone on China. I agree with Matt that a deal could be out there because the optics of that, but not disengaging. We've also seen the president commit to really robust naval deployments, naval shipbuilding, etc., in the Asia Pacific. And I guess my question to you is, given the national security strategy, which this one seemed to be in Donald Trump's voice, in contrast to the one done during his last, you sort of feel Donald Trump pulsing through these pages. My question to you is from a national security strategy perspective, Kelly. When you kind of look at the component pieces of power, how do you think this will play out in the Asia Pacific from your perspective? Is there a coherence? And I guess my question is, doesn't Europe see that coming? And do we end up with a really remarkably different 500 million people who are beyond strategic autonomy that develop strategic purpose in Europe that's disconnected from the US because they are feeling abandoned and left behind as America's looking at Asia?
Sure. I think actually, I know Yoon has to leave soon, so I didn't know if you wanted to talk about the so-called deal potentially with China first, and then I'm happy to take.
Yeah, Leon has 3 minutes, so yeah, go ahead, Yoon.
Yes, I'm really sorry. I have to run off. So this deal that has been discussed so much, right? That it was very widely expected in Busan that President Trump was going to say something. But I think on Taiwan, the president is still subject to domestic legislation, right? We have a Taiwan Relations Act. There's domestic politics. There's midterm election coming up. So I don't think that the president would necessarily have all the liberties that he would like to have to make a deal with the Chinese. And also think about it, what would that deal look like? If we give up Taiwan, it's permanent, it's irreversible. But if we get rare earth minerals from China, that's always reversible. So that will make it not necessarily a good deal for the White House. So I question both the feasibility and also the substance of that deal. That realistically speaking, what would make America hand over Taiwan? I'm sorry, I have to go, but it's such a great pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. Big round of applause for you. Thank you. Read her paper in Foreign Affairs. Let me come, something that's not in the mix and haven't talked about, but I actually think it reminds me of the TPP debate, Matt. And Kelly, I want you to jump in on this too. And so thank you for deferring time. But I want to have the USMCA. So trade, economic policy, one of the big things out there for big, US firms that are housed heavily in North America is whether the USMCA is going to become a zombie or going to be replenished. And if it isn't replenished and it becomes a zombie, then that's another question about what happens, what are the global economic ramifications and openings for China in that mess. But Kelly, let's go back to you.
Yeah, so I just wanted to go back to the question I didn't get to answer, letting Yoon talk about the so-called deal, which is really, where are we with like the Europe versus Indo-Pacific? And, are we going to sort of try to pivot again to Asia? And the idea being like to step up in Europe. I'll just say that I don't know if the administration, there are certainly people within the administration who have that idea that are prioritizers that want to see that happen. But I don't know if the administration has that clear of an idea if you actually look at the strategy documents. In the National Defense Strategy, they essentially talk about Europe as a model ally because it's spending more on defense. And so there is a chance here, I think, that that different allies, Europe included, find whatever magic spending number it is that satisfies Donald Trump, and things are largely status quo. It also talks about rewarding allies that spend more with more cooperation, which is not at all connected to U.S. interests. So, for example, if countries like Latvia or Estonia spend more on defense, does that mean that we're going to cooperate more with them and then cooperate less, say, with the Philippines that spends a little over 1%, even though it's inside the first island chain? That doesn't make sense from a strategic perspective. So what I think will likely happen is Europe will do more. We'll see to what degree it actually does more in a way that actually builds some kind of, actual capability independent of the United States, or actually burden shifts. Hopefully that will happen. They talk a lot, they don't actually act on it. But I think in the Indo-Pacific, by and large, you're going to see things with allies remain relatively around the status quo. There'll be some debates around what the percentage spending should be on GDP. But I think fundamentally, those alliances are going to probably continue to stay on sort of the status quo course that they are.
Matt, do you agree with that? Because what I'm hearing from Kelly is that a combination of popsicle sticks and band-aids and spending things is somehow going to keep NATO functioning and operating, America engaged. That's not what an alliance is. An alliance, Article 5, all for one and one for all, is basic fundamental trust that your security is going to be a community affair. I guess my question is, do Band-Aids and popsicle sticks solve the trust problem, or is Article 5 dead?
Well, Trump practically announced that recently about Article 5. I do think that there is a seismic change in Europe. I mean, that started before Greenland. I mean, goes back some time, but I do think that the key change was Germany getting on board with the idea you had to do strategic autonomy, and you know, I I certainly think it will take them some time, but I think the trust has, particularly under Trump, and we'll see who comes next. But I think even there, if you have a more favorable pro-transatlantis president, I do think that the Europeans have learned their lesson. I think the big issue, is actually on the financial side, where the Europeans have leverage. So if they go through with the Draghi reforms and build basically a unified capital market, and if they begin, they've started with the military, but if they go, which was in the Draghi report, and have a common infrastructure, tech bond issue, they'll pull in European money instead of it going to Wall Street, and
Right.
that's going to have the big effect.
Well, I mean,
And
take it
that's
a step further. Take it a step further. You're talking about the tools and processes that could really empower Europe. My view is, when Donald Trump was complaining, we had a weak Europe because America wanted a weak Europe. We complained, "Oh, you're not doing enough. You're not doing enough." But honestly, we want Europe to do what the United States,
No,
said to do.
that was exactly true, because being in government,
Yeah.
remember that Bush was so, this is the elder Bush, was so scared when the Maastricht Treaty
Right.
was being signed that suddenly the EU was going to have this defense dimension. Of course, at the time, I mean, Britain was in it, so Britain was carrying our water. So the worries were way over the top. But nevertheless, that's been a long time thing. Is we have to have the ability to make the decisions and then consult later.
So for your 2027 report, when you work on it, one of the things we have to consider is an emboldened Europe with capacity and attitude now going to be something that the global system has to contend with? There's a question from Yuri BCN, that says there's a lot of global commons things out there: shipping, cables, pipelines. I could make a long list of transnational rules and norms. Kelly was getting into this, that are part of the comfort zone of us all being connected to one another. And as this talks about, America withdrawing, contracting from those responsibilities and partnerships, what happens to that world? My answer would be that's where Mark Carney comes in, that there'll be new associations. But Kelly, to respond to Yuri, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's not new that we have these sort of global commons challenges, and particularly the undersea cable one, I think is quite interesting, because we're seeing a lot more, at least public reporting about threats to that. That's for sure. I would just say that, I don't think the administration thinks of it in a public commons sort of way. I think even the undersea cables things, they see that as part of certainly a national security issue and wanting to secure that. But they don't necessarily see it as a global commons issue that you would be getting countries together to try to establish rules and norms. So their approach is much more oriented towards a hard security and like a how do you physically secure these things. So it's just a different approach to the problem. Will other countries try perhaps to organize something more around the global commons? Perhaps. But I would just say on a number of issues related to sort of undersea cables in particular, we're actually seeing movement across the board, moving more in a hard security direction, like in Europe and like with Taiwan as well.
Matt, do you see, there's a great question here from Andrew Paterson. I'm pronouncing it right, Andrew. On the Japanese bond market. I remember Taggart Murphy's book, The Weight of the Yen, way back decades ago, talking about the global economy then and the power that the Japanese central bank had over U.S. economic policy. We just saw this incident this week on Japanese bond markets, shaking our bond market. Is there a part of the global power scene that we're neglecting in this? And is the bond markets a disciplinarian on some of this that we're not acknowledging enough of, Matt?
Yeah, yes. I mean, is the answer, but I think it's in the U.S. we don't understand that other people are trying to flee U.S. bonds and
Right.
dependence on the dollar. I mean that is the really big story. There's a graphic this morning, I think, in one of the newspapers showing how much the Chinese have dropped buying treasuries and instead are into gold. And that's why, I mean, the price of gold is going right through the ceiling. I mean,
Yeah.
and
I was with a bunch of commodity guys recently, Matt, and I think gold was 4,200, and they said by the end of 2026 it'll be over $5,000. Well, guess what? It was like a week. So it's like,
yeah, it's headed up to 6,000. It looks like. I mean, it's gone way over 5,000.
yeah.
But get back to your Suez crisis. Of course, the leverage we had over Britain was on the pound and pound sterling, and how we forced them out. I think our Suez crisis will be in the fiscal area far more than in force or military force, because we have no way of policing our own budget and what we spend.
Let me just ask real quickly.
Completely given up on this.
Just 30 seconds each. We're right at the end. Ted Gear says, hey, Ukraine hasn't really fit in the discussion. Interesting, it hasn't come up yet. It's actually a good reflection because I'd like to know, I remember Zbigniew Brzezinski saying, hey, there are defining challenges in the world and not defining. Really, for the last several years, if you went to security forums, Reagan Defense Forum, Aspen, Ukraine dominated. I remember James Cleverly from the British Foreign Secretary getting up saying, Russia has already lost the Ukraine battle. Ukraine's still with us. The question is it still defining or is it being pushed off the front pages? I love this question from Ted. And I just would love to get a sense of, is whatever happens in Ukraine significant, as you write in the report, for an empowered Putin, or is it becoming a less consequential conflict because we've demoted its importance to where the U.S. is going? Kelly, real quick.
I think the Trump administration has been honest about the limited stakes for U.S. interests in Ukraine, and you see that reflected. It's a different situation for Europe itself. And it's quite consequential for Europe. But to the extent it really matters to this administration, it's at a personal level for Donald Trump, who would like a Nobel Peace Prize.
Right. Matt, final thoughts, 15 seconds.
I think it's very consequential for U.S. influence in Europe. I mean, until recently, the East Europeans were the ones that were saying no to strategic autonomy, because the Americans were the ones that we wanted to bring in, just as we're talking about the Asians want U.S. security tie. The fact that we're just leaving aside Ukraine to fend for itself is undermining their confidence in us. And so I think, those kind of obstacles to strategic autonomy that were there a couple of years ago because the East Europeans didn't want to alienate the U.S. I think that's
Right.
waning.
Well,
So
listen,
I think
I want
it
to
is consequential.
I want to thank our panelists here. We've got Matt Burrows of the Stimson Center, well, all of the Stimson Center, Yoon Soon and Kelly Grieco. Thank you so very much for joining us. I want to recommend that people take a look at the top 10 global risks for 2026, authored by Matt Burrows and Robert Manning. And I just want to thank for an excellent candid discussion about complex times we're in. I want to thank all the people that posted questions. I wish we could have gotten to all of them. Tried my best to get to as many as we could. And now we're going to move on to a next session with Dr. Benjamin Gadan, who's Senior Fellow and Director of the Stimson Center Latin America Program, and Ambassador Jeffrey De Laurentiis, who is Distinguished Fellow for Stimson Strategic Foresight Hub. He's former Ambassador in Special Political Affairs at the U.S. Mission to the UN and the first charge at the U.S. Embassy in Havana following the reestablishment of diplomatic relations there. So thanks to everybody. I'm going to turn this over to Benjamin. So over to you. Thanks so much.
Excellent. Steve, thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction. Excellent panel. I look forward to the rest of the event. It's great to participate in a foreign policy conversation where Latin America really does take center stage in the U.S. approach to the world. That's not something that those of us who have focused on Latin America for quite a while are accustomed to saying, but it truly is indisputable. I thought maybe I would take just a minute or two before introducing you to my fellow panelists, Ambassador De Laurentiis, to talk about maybe how we got here. And then, Jeff will tell us where we're headed next, since this is a forward-looking conversation. And it really is true that the shift has been absolutely extraordinary so far in the year plus of this administration. And it's also true that it was not expected, right? That if we recall in President Trump's first term, there was very little evidence that he was interested in Latin America. He had visited the region just once, very briefly, for a global summit in Buenos Aires. He had not participated in the Summit of the Americas, the first time a U.S. president had skipped the event, which takes place only once every 3 years or so. But this time around, literally from the first day of the new administration, we got the sense that things would be different, right? In the inaugural address, many of you will remember that there was this threat to take back the Panama Canal that initially sort of seemed to be kind of quirky and come out of nowhere. But we soon learned that it was actually a pillar of what would be a dramatic shift toward Latin America. This was institutionalized in the national security strategy, which promised or threatened to, quote, restore American preeminence in the Western Hemisphere. And we even got a new name for the U.S. strategy in the Western Hemisphere, which was the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, this reference to 19th century U.S. policies in Latin America that had given the United States the right to intervene, initially to exclude external actors from Latin America, in those days Europeans, and then gave the United States what it called police power, this idea that the U.S. could intervene to pursue its interests, anywhere at any time. The Gulf of Mexico got a new name, and all of it added up to what appeared to be a really ambitious vision for re-engagement in the Western Hemisphere and for hemispheric domination, at least in the sense of military deployment. Thinking back now, right, this didn't come out of the blue entirely. The president has assembled a national security team, largely from the state of Florida, which always has interest in Latin America, but also appointed the first Secretary of State, who's a Spanish speaker, deeply experienced in Latin America policy, the son of Cuban immigrants. And also, if we look at what President Trump's top priorities were when he came into his second term, principally to reduce migration to the United States and to reduce the flow of drugs to the United States, both of those challenges have their origins largely in Latin America. Okay, so for all of this, maybe it does make sense that Latin America has turned out to be such a prominent part of President Trump's second term foreign policy agenda. What I guess I would still insist is surprising, even having made the argument that there is some logic to this pivot to Latin America, is the primary tool that the president has elected to use thus far, and that's the US military. And here we're very unaccustomed to seeing this kind of military deployment in action in our own hemisphere, right? We first saw this huge buildup of US warships and fighter jets in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific, and the use of these military assets. Since last September, I believe we've now seen attacks on 36 speedboats allegedly carrying cocaine, killing 126 civilians on board those crafts. And then most dramatically, on January 3rd, we saw the special forces, the Delta Force commandos, attack in Venezuela and abduct the president of Venezuela, its authoritarian leader, Nicolas Maduro, who is now in prison in Brooklyn and will stand trial for alleged cocaine trafficking in the United States, right? So we have gone from, an expectation that the new administration might not pay much attention to the region to a rhetorical approach to the region that was promising quite aggressive posture, to actual military action in the Caribbean and in South America for the first time. And that has raised a lot of expectations now going forward, where no one doubts the president's commitment to hemispheric preeminence, as he has described it in the national security strategy, to what's next, right? Which country might be attacked next? Which country might gain the kind of favoritism that we saw with a $20 billion bailout to the president of Argentina? Where is this policy headed now that the United States appears willing to dedicate certainly a lot of attention and maybe even a lot of national resources to domination of the Western Hemisphere? We have seen specifically threats not only to invade Panama, to seize the Panama Canal, but also to bomb targets in Colombia and in Mexico. We've already seen an invasion of Venezuela with the threat to re-engage militarily if necessary. But the most talked about potential target for the United States following the Delta Force Commandos' arrival in Caracas, the capital of Venezuela, has been Cuba. We've heard that repeatedly, both before the action in Venezuela, but most specifically in the days and weeks since. So for that reason, I'm so delighted that my friend and colleague, Ambassador Jeff De Laurentiis, is joining us today. Jeff, though an expert on all things Latin America and U.S. foreign policy, is particularly an expert on Cuba and U.S.-Cuba policy, having served as the head of our embassy in Havana from the years 2015 to 2017. My basic question, Jeff, although of course context would be helpful, is, what do you expect to happen in the next days and weeks in the U.S. policy toward Cuba?
Well, thanks, Ben. It's of course a good question, and there's probably no a specific answer other than, of course, to listen to the declarations of the administration. We just heard Secretary Rubio yesterday say on the Hill that, of course, they support regime change, although he seemed to caveat that it wouldn't necessarily be a military change, but that they would be encouraging other ways for this to happen. And of course, the big question is, will economic hardship translate into political collapse? And that's based upon the comments from the president about stopping oil and so forth. I think the thing to remember as we go forward in trying to decipher what the administration wishes to do is that Cuba is not Venezuela. So while it is true that the administration officials have made pretty clear that 2026 is going to be the year that they bring down the regime in Cuba, I don't think they've really generated a specific plan for it as yet. And again, the differences between the two situations, Cuba and Venezuela, are significant. Venezuela, and of course, by the way, we still don't know whether that's going to be a success or not. I saw headlines yesterday where Delcy Rodriguez complained about enough with U.S. orders, I think was the statement in speaking to some local groups. But in Venezuela, you of course had a very messy but significant democracy for decades and decades. You have a very strong civil society. You have organized opposition groups. There was an election conducted where it was very clear that the current folks in power did not win. And Cuba is very different. You have a one-party communist state for almost 70 years. You have, I would say, limited civil society. There aren't the organized kinds of groups. You have, I would say, close ranks, a certain amount of discipline. And of course, there's no indication from any authority in Cuba that they intend to make any changes. So it's a different approach, I think. And then let me also say, of course, the talk has been about oil and perhaps shutting off the supply of oil that Venezuela has provided. There are kind of conflicting reports about Mexico. Did they temporarily halt shipments? I think there was a Bloomberg piece this morning that said another will continue. It's a sovereign decision of Mexico. You have the Secretary of Energy, our Secretary of Energy, saying that they won't cut off supplies because they don't want an economic or humanitarian, rather collapse in Cuba. So it's hard to know. But of course, the other question is, what will Russia do? There's talk of deepening the relationship. There were recent discussions with China. They've offered a new round of support. How would they react to something like this? And then, okay, maybe a bit far afield, but you have Angola, Algeria. I mean, who knows? There are others out there, and it's hard to know how they will react. But of course, the bottom line is, if the oil supplies are cut off, it's going to be a significant challenge for the Cubans to cope.
Yeah, so maybe, you raise the obvious question of kind of what's to gain for the United States then in pursuing this, right? You've said there's a threat of a humanitarian crisis and an associated migration crisis if the Cuban economy collapses even further. It's already lost something like 10% of its population in the last few years. You've said that, a democratic transition would be complex. There's very little civil society. There's no opposition parties that are well established or have been permitted to build their cadres. And so, I have to ask kind of what's in it for the U.S. in pursuing this in the first place, right? In Venezuela, the justifications kind of were all over the map, but there was questions about its role in organized crime and cocaine trafficking, questions about the presence of China, of Iran, of Russia, questions about the access to Venezuela's natural resources, which of course Cuba does not have, particularly oil. So what is motivating the desire of the Secretary of State and the White House to pursue this, apparent regime change strategy in the first place?
Well, I think apart from a few years during the Clinton administration and the Obama administration, the policy, of course, of the U.S. government has been to maximize pressure and to push for a transition to democracy in Cuba. So this is obviously a long-standing goal. I would say that many members of the administration certainly strongly support this, and for sort of historical, perhaps personal, and geostrategic reasons, they would certainly like to see regime change. There is, again, a concern maybe that Russia or China might seek to take a stand here, but I think it's just a long-standing political quest. Right after the extraction of Maduro, several Cuban American members of Congress had a press conference, obviously strongly supporting this, but also said Cuba's next, Cuba's next, Cuba's next. The difference here is that I think it's going to be a lot more complicated. We also read that the administration is busily trying to find someone within the authority, Cuban authority, to negotiate with. But My guess is that's going to be a difficult task as well. Maybe not impossible, but probably very difficult. And of course, the other thing is in Venezuela, there's oil to finance all of this. Where are the billions and billions and billions of dollars going to come from to, in fact, help Cuba with any kind of transition?
So it's interesting. A couple of times, Jeff, you've brought up some of Cuba's important external allies, principally, Russia and China, as a potential constraint on the United States, a potential ballast for the Cuban government to survive under this pressure and maybe even increase pressure. I had earlier, summarized the new Monroe Doctrine, and instead of Europe, the implication is it's China and Russia who are no longer permitted to operate in the Americas under this new paradigm. And indeed, as far-fetched as that might sound, there was very little reaction from both of those countries to the U.S. raid on Caracas. There was virtually no assistance, certainly no military assistance that came to pass. And even the reactions were rather mild. Why are you so confident that China and Russia might be a factor now and going forward in U.S.-Cuba policy?
I wouldn't say that I'm confident. I'm saying that it's a possibility that shouldn't be automatically ruled out. Now, at the moment, we have what I would say, after some years at the UN, a rather unusual relationship with the Russian Federation. So I don't know how that would play into it, meaning the relationship between the president and the president of the Russian Federation. Again, I don't know where that fits. And of course, you're quite right. China has been reticent to engage in a more fulsome way in Cuba through the years. But again, I point to this sort of new round of support that the Chinese have announced. Whether that will be significant or not, it's hard to know. In terms of our kind of approach to the Western Hemisphere, our friend and former colleague in government, Jonna Nelson, just published a very interesting piece in the World Politics Review, where she, of course, suggested that this notion of restoring American military dominance, by the way, where we are already militarily dominant, but that and creating a sphere of influence, may or may not be particularly successful, because China already is the principal trading partner for most countries in South America, including those countries that are ideologically aligned with the Trump administration.
We have about 5 minutes left in our quickfire here, and I recall that our charge was to discuss not only Cuba and Venezuela, but U.S. policy more broadly in the Americas. I want to contradict something I said earlier, if you'd permit me, which is that the U.S. has pivoted aggressively to Latin America, and that there really is a renewed engagement and commitment of resources and attention. And in some ways, I think that's actually not true. I've written for the Stimson Center about what I call the Monroe Doctrine paradox, which is that we are, what I wrote, a bull in a china shop and a great disappearing act all in one. That we've become very aggressive militarily and rhetorically in the Americas, but that we've narrowed the U.S. agenda. Right? There's a long list of things we're no longer interested in. Among them, democracy and human rights, the fight against corruption, economic integration, which has been undermined by U.S. tariffs, including imposed on countries with which we have free trade agreements. We've seen USAID support evaporate, particularly in Central America, where it's quite consequential. And we've seen an erosion of U.S. soft power, where polls seem to suggest that the U.S. is viewed more negatively in many places. We've seen remittances now under threat because of increased deportations from the United States. That's a big deal in Northern Central America and in Mexico as well. And so I guess my question for you is, am I missing elements of economic statecraft, of diplomatic engagement? Am I underselling this pivot to Latin America? Because again, it seems to me to be quite limited in many ways, and even opening more space, arguably, for U.S. adversaries outside the narrow cases where a U.S. aircraft carrier can be the most consequential tool of U.S. hemispheric policy.
Yeah, well, I don't disagree with you, and I would say again that a reliance on U.S. military power in the Caribbean or in the area is not necessarily the key to domination across the hemisphere. I thought it was quite interesting following the, let's call it, extraction of Maduro, that of course the governments to the right, both right of center and far right, were congratulatory, even supported the move. Those countries on the other side, of course, were very critical. But I'm guessing that there is a tremendous amount of disquiet in the hemisphere about U.S. action and what's coming next. I mean, even in countries where the governments are supportive. Of course, this is something that they've worked against to try and develop a more equal relationship with the United States, and this is being challenged significantly. And I wonder how folks are going to react down the line if this continues. And ironically, Venezuela could be viewed as kind of a test case of course, the plan is stabilization, recovery, and transition. But I, as good as that looks on paper, I see all sorts of detours and problems along the way that have not really been planned out or accounted for. I mean, the repressive system in Venezuela is still very much intact. So what happened to human rights? What happened to the values that we've been trying to promote for decades? So there are a lot of, or this scheme involving Qatar with managing the resources and so forth. Lots of uncertainties, and never mind the question of whether all of this is legal or not.
And notably, Jeff, I mean, if we look at the last couple of decades of increased Chinese engagement in the region, it has not involved the abduction of any leaders, the appearance of any Chinese warplanes, but rather, investment in infrastructure and the, use of the Chinese market to, particularly in South America, buy a lot of commodity exports and to gain a lot of diplomatic and geostrategic influence. I guess quickly in the last minute we have, do you see, despite the tariffs, some kind of economic integration agenda materializing, an increase in U.S. investment? I mean, do you think that this strategy will eventually go beyond the armada assembled in the Caribbean?
Well, I hope so. You need some economic statecraft because if that isn't ramped up, we're going to see a policy that will not succeed. So and of course, in the end, in terms of China, what are they touting now? Stability, predictability. And so I think that's really what's needed as well, coming from Washington. So folks can at least understand what's coming next. Unpredictability works in negotiations and so forth, but in terms of midterm and long-term strategy, it does not.
Ambassador De Laurentiis, so great to hear your insights at a critical moment for U.S. policy in the Western Hemisphere. Fortunately, you're part of the Stimson team, so we will find lots of ways to draw upon your expertise in the coming weeks and months. Thank you so much, Jeff.
Thank you, Ben, for your insights as well.
Everyone, please stick around. We have plenty more to discuss in the future about Latin America, but right now we have lots to discuss about Ukraine, Russia, and the future of European security. I am going to hand off this conversation now to two of my terrific colleagues. Peter Sleskin is a senior fellow director of the Russia program at the Stimson Center. He's also the host of the Trialogue podcast, and also Emma Ashford, who's a senior fellow with Stimson's Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy program. Peter and Emma, I turn to you. Good luck, and thanks everyone for listening.
All right. Thanks so much, Benjamin, and thanks to the 183 brave members of the virtual audience. So, almost exactly 4 years ago, Russia invaded Ukraine, failed to carry off its planned special military operation, and found itself in a grinding conventional war, eventually retreating from Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Kherson. NATO appeared galvanized and gained new members in Finland and Sweden, and President Biden, at every opportunity, reiterated the United States' sacred commitment to defend every inch of NATO territory. The situation seems to have shifted a bit since then. Russia has the military initiative in Ukraine, and the trajectory for Kyiv and its Western backers seems bleak. The United States has reached out to Russia and made a grab for Greenland. At Davos, Trump questioned whether NATO allies would come to the aid of the US in case of conflict, and a number of European leaders, in Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney, made forceful statements about the need to move past dependence on the United States. So where do we go from here in the transatlantic relationship and the European security architecture? I think we could perhaps consider three ideal type scenarios. The first is that the transatlantic relationship endures more or less in its traditional form. Inertia is a powerful force, NATO is a massive bureaucracy, and transatlantic entanglements are strong. The US has tried to burden shift to Europe, I think, pretty much every decade since NATO's founding and has never pulled it off, so perhaps nothing changes this time either. The second scenario is a real structural shift along the lines proposed by the European leaders in Davos towards European strategic autonomy. And the final scenario is that the US pulls back and Europe falls apart, with fractious rivalries returning that have always existed on the continent, aside from a perhaps anomalous 80-year period of consolidation under American domination. So, Emma, which of these scenarios do you find most likely or preferable? And to what extent do you think the outcome in Ukraine might affect which path we end up taking?
Oh, it's great to be here, and good morning to everybody online. I think it's entirely likely that the most preferable scenario and the most likely scenario are in opposite directions here. But let me, I guess, just add sort of a few general points to what you're saying, because I think one of the most interesting things that we have seen in this last year, the first year of the Trump administration, has been this shift in discourse from it's all about Ukraine, right? The Europeans and Americans saying, the future of European security is through Ukraine, right? Win in Ukraine and then figure it out afterwards. And now we have shifted from that to something more like, well, Ukraine continues, it's there, it's important, it's still key in Europe, but we're talking much more about this transatlantic relationship. And so, for me, in some ways, Ukraine has become certainly not a sideshow, and it's certainly very important to the European states that are still pouring in resources, etc. But it has become disconnected in many ways from this broader question of transatlantic relations. And so a few interesting things that have happened on that in the last year, right? We saw that big 5% spending pledge by the allies at the Hague summit last year for NATO. There's been actually very little movement on security since that time, right? We've not seen the promised force posture review from the administration, no real talk of troop drawdowns or anything like that. That seems to be on hold. There's been a lot happening in the trade, culture, antagonism space. We saw the language in the national security strategy. We saw J.D. Vance's speech in Munich. And then, as you say, we've got Mark Carney standing up at Davos last week and basically telling, I think his audience was aimed very much at European allies of the United States, right? That they are middle powers, that they need to act like it, that they need to build up their own capabilities in order to assert themselves against the United States. And in many ways, I think it's a very accurate diagnosis, right? These countries in Europe have been very willing to let the US provide for them in security terms, but as we've seen in the last year, they've left themselves supremely vulnerable to sort of trade manipulation. And, you know, basically, if they want to sustain that security protection, then they've got to sort of give in on everything else. And I think that's not sitting very well, certainly in European capitals, but I think with European publics. Thus far, though, to get back to your question about these scenarios, I am not seeing the willingness of that sort of Mark Carney approach to this, that Europe is going to stand up and really push back against the United States. I'm not really seeing that. There were a few troops sent to Greenland as a signaling mechanism, but no real actual commitment there. Thus far, most European heads of state seem pretty happy to keep sustaining the war in Ukraine, appease the United States wherever possible, and, you know, basically just hope that something better turns up. So, I mean, let me, I guess, punt this question back to you, right? Do you think Ukraine has become disconnected from the transatlantic relationship, or are these two issues we still need to talk about together?
I think we need to talk about them in sequence, I suppose. I think they are disconnected fundamentally, but politically, Ukraine is a bottleneck that prevents these larger adjustments from occurring, adjustments that I believe to be inevitable. But as you say, now there has been a lot of talk, little action. Trump is tilting at literal windmills in every speech he delivers at the UN or in Europe. The Europeans are desperately seeking to preserve a status quo they understand is no more through the Ukraine issue primarily. I mean, the more Ukraine is an existential emergency, the greater their claim on continued American presence in Europe, at least for now. And the US administration, despite fairly aggressive and radical rhetoric, does not seem to be willing to pull the plug and have Kyiv look like Kabul.
Yeah, so I mean, look, I think it's in the security space where this bottleneck is primarily existing. And most of the action, as others have noted, has been in the trade space in particular. So I wanted to ask you about, because your trialogue covers not just Russia, but it also covers China. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about this Europe-China connection, right? Obviously, again, Mark Carney from Canada was over in China, but we've also seen Keir Starmer from the UK over there in the last few days. Do you think Europe will try to pivot outside the security space and sort of build other ties?
I think they are totally bound to the existing bloc, and it makes complete sense for them to signal that they have alternatives to the United States, given what they're witnessing in Washington. So I would expect nothing but visits from Canadians and Europeans to China. And the Chinese, as Yun is saying, are not sort of eager to extend the red carpet. They think that this is what is due to them as a great power in a massive economy. But certainly they have high hopes for Europe. But ultimately, I think there are clear limits to what Europe wants to do and the extent to which they can pivot. I mean, nobody's been able to pivot. Russia announced a pivot to Asia. The US has been pivoting to Asia. Europe can pretend that it'll pivot to Asia, but I don't believe it in any of the three cases.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the language of the last few decades really has been this pivot to Asia. We're all going to turn to Asia because it's so important. But in practice, I suspect what we're going to see is a more interconnected world globally, you know, where Asia is a very important node in this network, but not necessarily the one area that everybody focuses on. And the other thing, obviously, the Europeans have been talking about is the Mercosur trade deal that they've been hammering out with the Latin Americans that may or may not move forward. So perhaps we should pivot back to Ukraine itself for a minute, because I think we should talk a little bit about the state of play in Ukraine negotiations. which, one of the common narratives that we hear in Washington is that the Trump administration's attempt to reach peace in Ukraine has failed, right? And that just it's over, nothing is working, and it's time to sort of move on with, I guess, arming Ukraine and restarting or kickstarting this war into higher gear again. And I'm curious, again, you talked to a lot of folks on sort of all sides of this. Can you talk a little bit about where we are in terms of peace negotiations?
I think we've definitely entered a new stage. The trilateral talks that just took place, I think, last week and are going to resume in a couple of days are of a different level than what we've seen since Istanbul in the first year of the war. That doesn't mean that we're particularly close to an end. Everybody says that we're 90% there, but the 10% remaining is all the most important stuff: territorial disputes and its security guarantees. So I think, unfortunately, the two sides are going to have to fight it out a bit longer until the balance of forces becomes clear. And perhaps it never will. It will remain a quagmire, and the two sides will only come to some compromise or ceasefire through exhaustion. But the likelier scenario, I think, is that Russia's advantage becomes more obvious, that Ukrainian collapse becomes a real possibility, not necessarily probable, but that Ukrainian leadership in Kyiv and its backers in Europe see that there is a distinct possibility of a catastrophic outcome. And I think that will change the nature of the talks, and that, I don't know, might happen at some point next year.
I do think one of the more interesting things that we've sort of seen, or underrated things that we've seen in the last year, is there was this notion that when the US sort of cut off assistance to Kyiv, that there was going to be a very quick decline in their ability to fight. And what we've actually seen is European states were able to sort of step into the breach, primarily in buying US weapons, but also that there was this long tail of provision of security stuff guaranteed under the Biden administration, purchased several years ago, that is finally flowing into Ukraine. And so that shutoff has not been quite as dramatic and sudden as many people might have assumed. And I do wonder whether, we will hit a point a year or two out from now where that sustainment starts to become a problem. And, one of the bigger questions that I have is, if we're talking about European states building up their own capabilities, at a certain point, the money that you need, the euros needed to build up your own defense versus the euros needed to supply Ukraine, there are going to be some hard budgetary choices there if this keeps going for years and years.
Well, to pose again the question that I asked at the start, what do you think of the possibility of real European strategic autonomy? Right now, they're making more gestures than real action, but do you think it is in the cards? What would it look like? They have these euros. Can they spend them on real military potential at a continental level, or is that a doomed project because the institutions are not suited? NATO is a US shop and the EU was built for other purposes.
I mean, this has always been the problem with, coherent, connected European security, right? One problem was they didn't spend enough, fine. The second problem was that figuring out who organizes European defense across all of these countries that aren't actually a suprastate, no matter what the European Union thinks, is very, very difficult. And I will say, I think we've seen some major steps on that, even in the last year, but certainly since the war in Ukraine started, we've seen the European Union get engaged in funding mechanisms for how you go about defense procurement. We've seen states come to some of these mini-lateral arrangements that might be very helpful in building up. But at the end of the day, I don't think we've seen any quantum leap in how states in Europe cooperate on defense funding, despite all the talk about strategic autonomy. For me, the other question that we should be asking that I think is kind of an interesting one is the extent to which that is necessary. You posed earlier, that it's this choice between sort of, does Europe come together and create a coherent defense, or does Europe disintegrate into fractious, squabbling rivalries. And I'm not sure it has to go in those directions. I think that there is probably a middle path where Europe can.
I did say ideal type alternatives, not that these
Exactly,
were
right.
necessarily the only probable scenarios.
But I suspect that there's a middle path where Europe can muddle through. And in particular, not to borrow from my friend Samantha Maitre here, but Germany really is the key. If Germany actually succeeds in pushing the euros that it has committed in its budget into rearmament, in sort of reorganizing its defense, if it manages to do that over the next 4 or 5 years, and then that bolsters sort of the Poles next door who are already very militarily capable, in many ways, you don't necessarily need a unified whole of Europe defense under one single command. You need cooperation mechanisms, you need chain of command sorted out, but the capabilities that you need could be produced by these states themselves and then help to produce that sort of common defense across all of Europe. Even if the Spanish aren't willing, you don't actually need them. So I don't think it's necessarily a make or break moment for Europe in that sense.
Although you are a good, hard-headed realist, right? And do you really think that it is likely that substantial German rearmament will bolster Polish military efforts and self-confidence? It could obviously have a very different effect and has historically.
It certainly could. And I don't discount the notion that on a long enough timeline, perhaps John Mearsheimer was right when he said in that 1992, I think it was, article, that Europe after the Cold War was going to descend back into fratricidal warfare. It's possible he was correct over a long enough timeline. I don't think so. I think the nations of Western Europe have become so much more economically integrated and culturally assimilated. They share similar governance systems. They are tied together through the European Union at this point. It does not seem likely to me that you would see a war between Germany and Poland. There's also the fact that, as any good realist would point out, it's about relative threats, right? If the Poles continue to perceive Russia as the main threat and German rearmament as assistance in combating that threat, then they're all on the same side. So again, I think the worst case scenario predictions, they're certainly possible, but my inclination would be to say we're going to see something far less extreme.
Yeah, I don't think it would happen in the short term, but there certainly is a possibility that if rearmament is only possible on sort of a national scale, then Germany begins to look at Poland, Lithuania asks for German troops to protect itself not only from Russia, but from Poland, which it has historically been wary of. France begins looking at Germany, and so on and so forth as a cascading effect. And that would certainly be an ironic result, given sort of the consolidated position and consensus that there is only a single threat in the East. I also thought it was, I guess, proof of your point that Europe is now an ever-flourishing garden that you categorized Poland as a Western European state. But to pivot to Washington, you have long advocated a revision in the transatlantic relationship and more European autonomy. Back when that was an unorthodox and dissident position, now it is the established policy. What do you think? What do you make of your new circumstances? Are you now part of the choir? Or do you think that it's sort of sounds good, but is being realized incorrectly in some respects?
I think this administration has taken some very good steps on burden shifting to allies, not just in Europe, but elsewhere. But I also think there is a relatively muddled Europe policy. And one of the things that I would point to is the national security strategy, which not only talks about burden sharing on the one hand, but on the other hand starts talking about America's civilizational interest in seeing a Europe that in many ways reflects conservative values that the Trump administration would like to see itself here at home, and then talks about America's interest in seeing those carried through in Europe, whether that's on migration or governance or free speech or other issues. And so for me, one of the problems that I see is it's not that this reflects some lack of interest in Europe from the Trump administration. I think, if anything, they're making it clear that they genuinely care about Europe and they think that Europe is important to the US. It's that the notion of responsible burden shifting at the same time as the US is going to meddle in the domestic politics of European nations and potentially push against the European Union and seek for that to disintegrate, those things are directly opposed in my mind. So I find this strategy to be quite problematic. And I do think, again, I think it would be very much in the US interests for capable European allies to build up their own military capabilities so that they can defend themselves. I think that would actually be a win-win for both countries, because then we end up with more advanced industrialized democracies that can defend themselves and sort of help with, defense against other autocracies or bad actors around the world. I think that would be a real win-win. But instead, this administration seems to be talking about Europe more as vassals, but vassals that perhaps pay a lot more. And so for me, that's quite problematic. I don't know what you think about this. Do you want to weigh in on this one as well?
No, I want to ask you to clarify part of what you just described. So you said that ideally Europe would step up, would be more capable militarily, presumably within NATO, and would be able to defend against threats, autocracies. So what threats are those, and are they shared? Because it seems that the underlying logic of the alliance is that there is some common threat that all the allies together can better defend against. And that was obviously the Soviet Union for much of NATO's history, and has been either an empty space or Russia since. I think many people here now believe in the US that Russia does not pose a conventional threat to America. There are probably many in Europe who also doubt the extent of Russia's threat, and we can see that in the behavior of various Iberian countries. So is China an alternative, or is Russia galvanizing enough as a dragon to get the knight in shining armor off his horse, or onto his horse?
This is the paradox of the last 4 years since the start of the full-scale invasion in Ukraine. It's that Russia has simultaneously shown itself to be very threatening to states, certainly in Central and Eastern Europe, and at the same time shown itself to be less militarily capable than we thought. And so it is something that those states could potentially handle by themselves. Perhaps not tiny Estonia, right? But the Poles certainly could do a good job of defending themselves. And so for me, I see America as having strong interests in Europe, particularly in seeing that Europe remains free, not dominated by a state like Russia that's unfriendly to the United States. I want Europe to remain prosperous and one of our major trade partners. The difference really is from the Cold War to now, I believe that could be handled by the European states without direct US involvement. We can be a backstop, right? If some new Soviet Union arises or China takes all of Eurasia, then the US can come back in and get involved. We just don't need to do that right now. And so, I think, again, this notion of Russia as a threat, but a limited threat, is very helpful for sort of clarifying the US strategic position at this time.
Well, that's an optimistic outlook to end on, at least the way that you framed it. So thanks, Emma. Thanks to everybody who's still listening. And we need to make sure that you don't go anywhere, because the next quickfire is coming, and it is called AI Power in the Future of the Technology Race. Speakers will be Julia Neer, a research analyst with the Strategic Foresight Hub at the Stimson Center, and Julian Mueller-Kahler, a senior fellow and the director of the Strategic Foresight Hub. Julian and Julia, off you go.
Well, thank you very much, Peter and Emma, for talking about Europe and the European security architecture, and all other speakers previously who have engaged us this morning. it is our job now to bring you all home for the next 20 minutes to talk not so much about, questions of geostrategy and hard security issues, but more tech related, though I guess we all live in a time where high tech has come to signify high politics as well. I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague, Julia. And in the next 20 minutes, we will try to unpack some of those elements when it comes to AI power and the future of the technology race. Before we go into the hard power, hard security elements, Julia, I want to spend a bit of time talking about AI itself. Steve Clements, moderator of the panel earlier, alluded to the fact that Trump was the dominating voice at Davos this year. But of course, before Trump made his trip to Switzerland, AI was on pretty much every agenda and every topic of conversation in Davos. So if you are looking at the latest developments, maybe projecting them out a little bit more than just 2026, what are the things that you are most worried about, and where do you see opportunities when it comes to this technology as it diffuses into societies around the globe?
Sure. Thanks, Julian, for having me, and thanks to the whole Simpson team for putting on such a great event today, and thanks to the audience for being here as well. There are a lot of risks that people talk about when it comes to AI, and there are a lot of concerns, future concerns that people see in the news and that kind of thing. And so I'm not going to touch too much on the general cybersecurity, CBRN, hard security risks that we talk about, while I do think those are really important. I think there are some underrepresented kind of second and third order risks that are important to address too. So for me, there are two kind of pieces related to the global landscape that I think could be really big risks. One of them is the increase in global inequities when it comes to AI, because AI can really be a force multiplier for people and countries and regions who are able to access it and leverage it to build their economies and to grow productivity and to lift people up. That exponential growth won't be seen in regions where AI is not as accessible and AI is not as easy to implement in ways that boost productivity at scale. So you see a real possibility of, and that's why I think these digital sovereignty, these AI accessibility questions get so controversial and get so heated in international spaces, is because there's a real possibility of some people feeling like they've been left behind. And so I think that's something that's very likely to play out on the global stage in the next several years, because when a country lacks the infrastructure or the resources to build a strong AI ecosystem, that's not really an easy or immediate fix. The second piece that I would want to talk about there is kind of the potential balkanization of our global technology infrastructure. Obviously, we've talked a lot about competition today, and with AI, you talk a lot about the AI race and the geopolitics of that. One of the risks that you see with that a lot of technologists and people within the community cite is, I think historically, the internet, technology were spaces that really valued openness and freedom and interaction and collaborativeness between different actors, with obvious caveats in the national security spaces and in certain areas, of course. But I think that spirit of openness and that interconnectedness is definitely disintegrating, particularly as we lean into these technological races between great powers. And you run a very real risk of seeing standards that are incompatible with each other, with seeing norms that are incompatible with each other, and with really seeing a fracturing of what has thus far been a relatively global technology ecosystem. So those are the kind of two international relations pieces that I would mention. And then on the kind of societal pieces, I think there are two really important things to talk about. One, very much in the news lately, which is kind of the loneliness and companionship issue. There are some very surprising, or maybe not surprising, statistics about how many people are using AI as a therapist, as a friend, as a companion, especially young people. And there are very likely to be significant social and political repercussions to people turning to AI rather than to each other. And there's a lot of discourse in kind of the social sciences and psychology around that. The flip side of that I would say is, as people turn to AI also for information, as AI replaces search in particular online, as AI is used to filter and regulate and disseminate information on our social media and on the web in general, you see significantly a breakdown of the ability of people to discern between true and false. And it's, even if you see an image that is AI generated, the emotional impact of that image is likely to stick with you. And so it's not quite as simple as labeling things as real or false. And then when it comes to news, obviously there can be a great exacerbation of siloization within information and popular culture and media and political news in particular. So those are the two things that I worry about when it comes to the societal impacts. There are obviously many more, but I'd love to hear, Julian, from your perspective. I know you have some similar thoughts and some different thoughts in this area. I'd love to hear what you think about those risks as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Julia, you make such good points, and I want to focus on the second and third order implications, particularly on a societal level when it comes to the implementation of AI and other technologies in sort of the later part of the conversation. But let us stick a little bit more on the geopolitical element of it. You said, that the global tech stack used to be an international endeavor, and now with the technology race particularly emphasized during the Biden administration, and it is a little bit unclear in which direction the Trump administration is taking this, but the main competition between the United States and China. I think, as a German, having the outside perspective of the US foreign policy environment here in Washington, D.C., what is really interesting is that US primacy is often defined not just through the lens of military primacy or political primacy, but also increasingly through the lens of economic and technological primacy. And I think China, in that regard, just looking at the sheer numbers and the levels of investment that the country is making, obviously is a peer competitor. Both in terms of GDP growth, in terms of domestic consumption based economies, but also in terms of technological capabilities. For those of you who are spending some time in China, the level of adaptation, particularly in the AI and technology space, is truly remarkable, actually far ahead of that in the United States. And the race that the US is running is more towards defining or like reaching artificial general intelligence instead of really looking at levels of adaptation. Now, the other element, of course, is sort of the hardware component, right? A lot of people define or compare the AI race with the race towards nuclear capabilities. And in the nuclear way, often, you can go to MIT, you can go to Harvard and learn how to build a nuclear weapon theoretically. What you can't do is you can't enrich uranium or plutonium that is needed as sort of the fuel for nuclear weapons. Now, if you use that analogy, in the AI race, the fuel to power AI systems would, of course, be data. Very hard to restrict countries and entities to collect vast amounts of data that is needed to power AI systems. So I think the community has gone towards an approach where you, other than in the nuclear field, you're actually trying to restrict the capabilities of building those technologies. And that is, of course, first and foremost, compute power. That is where you are seeing, particularly during the Biden administration, the policy of both preventing the Chinese from acquiring high-end chips and semiconductors, but also, and I think this is the more deliberate and potentially consequential decision, to not just stop the selling of chips, but also stop the selling of the machinery necessary to produce those chips. And I think what we have seen in recent years is almost like unintended consequences of that policies, namely the Chinese building their own AI ecosystems. And I think that is exactly speaking to the point, Julia, that you were making of, are we seeing a tech divergence? Are we seeing different technology stacks being developed in different parts of the world where norms and standards are no longer going to be interoperable if we are seeing different technology stacks being developed? And what does that mean for competition in other parts of the world? China has a huge footprint in Africa, has a huge footprint in Asia, markets that the United States has lost ground to China. And so is China going to be the one setting the norms and standards? I know, Julia, that you spend a lot of time on particularly governance questions. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on what that means for the government's questions. If you asked many people here in the United States what it actually means to win the AI race, you either get the answer saying, okay, we have to get to first to general artificial intelligence first, or we have to be the ones that set the norms and standards. And if I can add a sub point to it, how does open source fit in all of this? I mean, a lot of this technology is, in the past, has been based on open source technology, basically being free for all. And now you're adding this layer of securitization in the AI sphere, but you still have an open source community that pushes, advanced models that might not be as powerful as, ChatGPT or competitors, but pretty close, right? So what are your thoughts on those two elements?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack there. And on the governance piece, there's actually a question in the chat that's also touching on this, on regulation and how it relates to the AI race. And I think that something that's important to really tease out is what we mean by regulation when we talk about AI, because I think that there's a common misconception that regulation equals harming innovation, stopping developers from doing what they want to do. There are certainly cases where excessively onerous regulation can make it really hard for people to innovate and make it hard for them to create new technologies. There's been a lot of critique in particular of the EU's approach to AI regulation through the EU AI Act, which basically approaches AI comprehensively, targeting it across industries and sectors as a technology rather than focusing on it application by application, though within the law itself, it does break down risks based on applications, but it's a comprehensive AI law rather than focusing on pieces of the puzzle one at a time. That approach has been criticized a lot as potentially cutting off innovation, making people, innovators and technology developers, afraid to build technology for fear of going afoul of regulation. So I think one thing that's important to tease out here is that regulation can also mean creating legislative certainty for businesses that enables them to carry out their operations in a sustainable way. I think there's a lot of concern in the business community in Silicon Valley right now about, number one, being a credible source of AI for consumers. There's a lot of skepticism, particularly increasingly actually with young people, about using AI and its merits and its pros and cons for society as a whole, particularly once you get into the labor questions, because people are afraid of losing their jobs. And so I think it's really important for AI companies to demonstrate trust, to demonstrate compliance, and to demonstrate a commitment to safety. And I think regulation done well provides companies with an avenue to do that. I think that a lot of countries, like beyond the EU, other countries and jurisdictions are figuring out their approaches to this question. In the US so far, I don't think that there is like really a solidified approach. As many of you know, there was a proposed moratorium in the BBB around basically halting state regulation of AI for a period of time to allow the federal government to put out a comprehensive law. That obviously did not pass, and it also met with a great amount of consternation about, again, passing a comprehensive law, what that would take, the amount of legislative agreement and coherence, and also the amount of comprehensiveness that you would need to target an entire technological sector at once. So there really isn't, I don't think that there really is like one way to do AI regulation that has been proven as the right way. But I think that we can definitely make space for conversations that think about AI regulation as a tool and not just as a constraint. On the open source piece, I think that's something that needs to be explored as well, because I think within the open source community, as I mentioned before, the concerns about openness and balkanization are really prevalent, particularly when it comes to possible regulation of the open source AI space and the open weight AI space, thinking about regulation that then basically fragments an ecosystem that really relies on collaborativeness and interconnectedness. And so that's obviously a concern as well.
Julia, let's spend a little bit of time to talk about the second and third order implications of AI, because I think they're in the debate often overlooked. Sure, you see even now technology evangelists or people that truly support the mission, even work for those companies that develop the technology, sitting on stage of Davos and warning of mass unemployment and unreadiness, sort of creating those doomsday scenarios, which I think are certainly warranted to some degree, but kind of mystify the debate a little bit in the sense of just creating a doom and gloom picture. Of course, often I think the transition will be slower. It's sort of like the frog being boiled without noticing it. But Axios currently talked about a low fire, low hire economy, where you see tremendous productivity gains within the existing workforce, but often particularly junior positions are now being automated in the knowledge economy. So if we were to think about, almost from a foresight perspective, about the second and third order implications, what is the thing that you think is often overlooked, and how do you think from a regulatory perspective as well, those aspects need to be taken into consideration. And after you, share your thoughts, I'll chime in as well.
Yeah, I know you have some great thoughts here as well, so looking forward to that. But I mean, I think this is really what I alluded to towards the beginning. I think that the concern with the second and third order applications to me is kind of about the fabric of society and how people interact with each other when they're also interacting with AI significantly. And I think there's a lot of research that's been done about, what does it mean to have a friendship with an AI model where you can ask that AI for anything. It can give you anything, but you can't meaningfully give back to it the way you would in a human friendship. And there's no exchange in that way. So what does that mean for then how we approach human-to-human relationships in our daily life? On the information side, what does it mean when we can't tell what is true and false? Online, does it mean that we just become more entrenched in our own beliefs and in our own social circles, and there's less room for collaborative debate and understanding of one another? So I think there are a lot of concerns, particularly about the way that interaction with AI can filter the way that we interact with the real world. And I think to me, that's the main concern. It doesn't have an easy answer. It doesn't have an easy solution, but I think it's important to be aware of it and to think about ways that we can kind of safeguard the underpinnings of kind of like human relationships and connectedness that make up our society. But I'd love to hear your takes on that as well.
Yeah, two elements. You touched on one of them. I think that we are already living in a very low trust society, right? If you look at public trust in democratic institutions, in traditional media outlets, it is at an historic all-time low, which is, partially explaining the rise of populism and the kind of politics that we are seeing at the moment. So adding additional layers of deception, so to say, where you can no longer distinguish between truth and reality, where deepfakes are proliferating around the internet, AI-enabled deepfakes, I think is sincerely deteriorating the way that we communicate with each other in the digital space, and kind of brings it back again on the personal level. What I find always interesting, even if you sort of anthropomorphize the technology in that sense, is like, well, we wonder why AI is hallucinating or telling wrong things. Well, humans lie all the time. We tell wrong things all the time to other people, but at the end of the day, it's again, the social norms are always based on trust. So is it people and communities that you trust? And I think we're probably going to see a move back to those roots of personal communication. The other element that I would love to mention is kind of the rewiring of society writ large with AI technologies. I think that, and this is a nice arc to the way that we opened this panel with Kurt Mills, the event this morning, when he said that among the MAGA base there is this feeling and perception that globalization didn't really work for the American middle class. And I think there are a lot of numbers that you can point to support that perception. Declining life expectancies, stagnating wages, etc. But to that point, much of that was driven by automation and not necessarily by globalization. If you look at the numbers in and of itself, to say that the United States didn't benefit from globalization would, of course, be a vast exaggeration if you look at GDP growth. But it would be equally wrong to say everybody benefited from globalization. And the same is true for automation. If you compare the share of labor intensity and square that with profitability and revenue of major companies, you simply don't need as many people to create profits and revenue as you did in the past. It's sort of this Ford model of we're producing more cars, meaning more people are employed to produce those cars, and you have a distributive effect through the hiring. And our entire tax system is based on that idea. We tax income for that sake, right? We are having the idea that we give tax incentives to a company because ultimately what it meant was that this company hires people, those people have employment, they build communities, they have families, they pay their taxes, and wealth is spread. if you look at companies like NVIDIA or others, or even the investments into data centers, I mean, Apple is investing $500 billion in data centers, creates 20,000 jobs. And that is great. That can be a utopian scenario in which, we don't have to work anymore in order to produce GDP. We let the robots, the dark factories, do that work for us. But the question at the end of the day comes down to distribution. How are we sharing that wealth so that, some people in Davos were saying that otherwise the mob is coming for those trillionaires that benefit from it. I think it's a legitimate concern, in the sense that we have to completely rethink the way that we tax, the way that we organize society, and the way that shared prosperity is enabled in the age of vastly automated tasks. And I think we are only at the beginning of that conversation. And unfortunately so, I think that the discussion is vastly tilted towards other aspects of that, instead of addressing the most imminent threat that's before us. Now, Julia, we have a couple minutes left, so I want to get a little bit philosophical in that sense. One of the best definitions that I've ever heard of intelligence was from a professor in Germany, who said that intelligence is the ability to make decisions in the area of non-knowledge. So the term artificial intelligence is actually really misleading, because at the end of the day, it's fancy pattern recognition in remarkable ways. From an almost like a technologist perspective, where do you see the technology going, in the sense of, are we close to AGI that resembles human intelligence in the sense, or is this the wrong way to think about it? And that the discussion is sort of tilted in that sense. And I mean, obviously, there's a lot of corporate interest in that debate. But at the end, just love to hear your thoughts on how you're thinking about that.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not a technologist. I'm not working on developing AGI, so I definitely don't have the deepest insight into the space that I could. But from what I've observed and from talking to technologists, I think there really is a lot more debate on the feasibility and the probability of AGI than what a lot of mainstream media would suggest. I think there is a lot of it's really hard to figure out if AGI is going to be made until it has been made. And I think there are a number of technical constraints, such as the compute capacity, the data capacity, the evals that such a model would need to pass, that it doesn't make it necessarily clear that we're going to achieve AGI in the immediate future. I do think it's important to, and so while I can't say for sure whether we're going to have it or not, I do think it's important to kind of critically assess the rhetoric around AGI and take a note of the fact that a lot of people who talk about the future of AGI are people who stand to benefit a lot from it. I think that if you see a company coming out and talking about the risks of AGI and the things that we need to do to stop it from coming, you should take a moment and think about, okay, if AGI is real, does this company stand to benefit a lot from it? Does the valuation of AI, we can get into the whole AI bubble thing another time. We're out of time here, but if we think about who stands to gain from the language surrounding AGI, I think it's important to be a little bit critical and a little bit hesitant about fully leaning into the AGI narrative until we can kind of see what happens.
Great. Well, that does, of course, not mean that the technology is becoming increasingly powerful and can do a whole sorts of things. Probably better than humans can, but as long as that is not the case, we are delighted to bring you human intelligence from the Stimson Center, and we are so thankful that you decided to spend the morning with us. This concludes the end of our programming. I hope you stay tuned, check out the website. I want to thank all of our speakers and panelists to join us this morning, but also the staff that made this event possible behind the scenes. And to all of you, our audience, that you have taken several hours of your day to stay with us and listen to briefings and expertise here from the Stimson Center. And last but not least, we, of course, wish you all a happy and healthy 2026. And I hope that we'll see you again for a similar event in 2027 for when we assess the risks and see